So one of my viewers was having trouble getting some real damage with Sukuna, and I guess it's because there are certain gimmicks that Sukuna has, which is not very well explained in this game. So I'm gonna do a how to play Sukuna correctly guide, and hopefully with this video, it will help you guys to actually get the maximum amount of damage out of him, because he's definitely one of the best DPS in the game. Okay, so what makes him slightly different to a lot of the other characters is that if you actually take a look at his skill kit, which I'm not going to read out, on the screen, you guys can just read it by yourself. But if you actually take a look at a lot of them, you realize they do actually do something called Laceration. I think that's how you say it, Laceration, which is basically like bleed with damage over time. So for example, if you take his skill 1, it's able to apply 1 stack, which is equal to 20% of curse technique, and it lasts for 3 turns. And then if you actually take a look at his skill 3, depending on how many stacks or how much curse energy you have, you can apply a lot more stacks of Laceration, and it also gets stronger as well, as similarly for his domain expansion. So a lot of time, actually, a lot of the damage that Sukuna will be doing is actually from this damage over time rather than from the skill itself. So as a result, if you actually want to know how to play Sukuna correctly, the first thing you need to understand is that how does the damage calculation for Laceration actually work, because it's not very well explained in this game, when is the damage calculation actually taken. So that's basically what I'm going to do in the first half of the video, just to get that kind of out of the way so everyone's on the same page on how does damage calculation actually works for damage over time. And then in the second half of the video, I'll be tailoring it a lot more to Sukuna to talk about, what are the best recollection, what team you want to play him in. Okay, now let's start off with the actual, explanation of Laceration. So we all know it's a damage over time, right? And it does say 20% of curse technique. However, it lasts for 3 turns. So how is the damage actually calculated? And we can simply test this by actually playing into a battle. So here I'm just going to test it with just Sukuna on the team by himself, just so we're very clear in terms of how much damage he's able to do. Now, I want you guys to pay extra attention to the actual numbers here and see whether they actually change or not. So what we're going to do is we are going to use his skill 1 first. This will basically apply only one single laceration, and it's going to last for 3 turns. So we're going to apply this now. It will do some damage by itself, as we will see on the screen. So it does a single damage with 5.5k. However, at the end of that turn, it may apply another 2,043 damage to the enemy. Now, pay close attention to the damage itself. It's 2,043. That was the damage from the damage over time, and the initial damage was about 5.5k. Now, let me use his skill 2. Skill 2 doesn't do anything. It doesn't actually apply Laceration at all. And basically, the reason why I'm going to do skill 2 is I don't care how much damage it's going to do, but I want you guys to pay attention to the damage over time at the end of turn. And you can see it's 2043 again. And that's the exact same number from the very first turn. Now, if you guys have been playing this game, you know there's always a bit of RNG element in terms of how much damage you do. There's normally a bit of like a ceiling and a floor, and the damage can fluctuate between that. However, we got the exact same number twice in a row, and that already gives you an indication. The damage calculation for damage over time is not actually decided per turn. It's actually decided on the very first time when you activate that move. And we can further test this again. Now, obviously, there's still a bit of fluctuation in the sense that if I restart the battle, we may get a slightly different number to 2043 in terms of damage over time. However, my point is that whatever damage over time you get for the very first turn, it's going to be identical to what you get the second turn, and also what you'll be getting on the third turn, because the damage calculation is already done at the first turn when you actually activate the attack. So I'm going to do another example here, which is by playing Nanami in the team as well. So I'm going to do this. I'm just going to quickly change the recollection bits as well. It'll be obvious why I do that in a later time. What recollection do I want on this? Let me put on this one, which also increases crit, and I will be testing some crit damage later on as well. Okay, but just pay close attention again to what I'll be doing now and how you see the damage will change. Now, previously, what we have done was a 5.5k attack on our very first hit, and then about 2k damage over time. Now, if we actually apply the buff from Nanami, now remember this lasts for 4 turns, okay? So if I apply it straight away on turn 1 and then use this again, first of all, we will expect the normal attack to be higher than 5 point something. As you can see, it's 8k now. So that's a lot higher. And you can see the damage over time now is 2.8k. So once again, it's actually higher than whatever we had before. So this already shows that any kind of buff you apply to yourself is going to apply not just to the attack itself, but also going to apply to the damage over time. However, now let's do this again. And once again, for Sukuna, I'm going to use skill 2 just so that I don't apply any more damage over time. However, for Nanami, I'm going to use his skill 2 again. Now, because I already have the buff from the first turn on Nanami, you can see I already have the damage down. If I am to use this again, what we should see is that the damage, Sukuna should be ending up with 2 stack of buff on himself. However, is that actually going to change the damage over time? So remember what we just saw right now. The attack itself already done some damage. However, the damage over time was around 2.8k. I can't remember the exact number. You guys can scroll back if you want to see the exact number, but it's about 2.8k. So now if we actually apply a second buff to him, is the damage over going to change? Damage over time going to change? Let's see. You can see the damage over time is still 2.8k. So the damage over time didn't change, even though theoretically he actually have 1 extra buff on himself. So once again, that just shows whatever damage over time is going to be calculated, it's going to be at the very first time when you actually activate the skill. So even if you apply more buff or debuff afterwards, it's not actually going to change how much damage you will be doing because it's already calculated on the very first turn. I already done this for a buff, which you can activate on Sukuna himself. Let me just quickly show you for debuff as well, so you know it also works the exact same way. Okay, so now let's do a debuff. So when we do the debuff, what we are going to do is we're just going to simply change this to Gaku Genji, who obviously do a curse technique debuff, which will increase our damage. So now if we do this, now remember what we've seen before, without any buff, the actual damage over time was only about 2k, okay? It was 2.8k with Nanami's buff, however, just by Sukuna himself, it should only be 2k. So now if we actually apply this, and then actually do damage over time here with Sukuna, let's see how much it will actually change. So now you can see the damage over time is now actually 3k. So once again, this just shows whatever damage dealt buff or curse technique debuff, etc. that you apply to your Sukuna is actually going to change how much damage over time you're going to do. However, it's only going to be calculated at the instance when you actually use that attack, okay? Now the next thing I want to show you guys is whether a critical hit is going to affect your damage over time, because Sukuna does have a skill 2 which buffs his own crit rate. Now, if you remember from before, if I don't do any buff or debuff, the attack from Sukuna itself, so the skill 1, does about 5.5k damage with the damage instantly, and then the damage over time was around 2k. So now let's try to use this Recollection, which increase crit rate, and we were not lucky enough to get a crit, but it kind of shows you it was 5.7 damage at the instant, and then about just under 2.1k damage over time, okay? So that's basically our baseline to compare against. So now let me try to reset for a crit. The same with this kind of like tower floors is the enemy have like a built-in crit resistance. So even though the crit rate you can see on the Recollections at 65%, it's going to be weakened by quite a bit when we actually try to reset for the crit. So hopefully we can see it soon. You can see a crit, it does about like 7.5k, I believe. However, what you can see here is the damage over time is 2.2k. So it's definitely not as large increase. In fact, I'm not even sure whether that is an increase from your normal damage over time, because normally it was, I think it was 2.1k previously that we have seen. And whereas the raw damage, the instant damage from skill 1, we saw it jump from like just under 6k to 7 point something k. So that jumped by quite a bit. Whereas the damage over time, that feels like more like a fluctuation. So the conclusion I'm going to make here is that crit it's not actually going to affect your damage over time. So the damage over time can be affected by any kind of like curse technique or damage dealt buff or debuff. However, it's not actually going to be affected by any crit rate increase or crit damage increase from your skill 2. And that's going to be important later on when we actually talk about, what kind of move you actually want to do with your Sukuna, okay? So that's basically what I want to show you guys in terms of the crit. Now that basically just take care of how is the damage from laceration actually being calculated. So just a bit of a recap. It's not affected by crit, however, it's affected by all other kind of like buff in terms of like damage dealt, workers technique, and it's also being calculated at the very first instance when you do the attack. So even though the damage is over quite a few turns, the calculation is already done at the time when you actually use the attack for the very first time. Okay. Now the next thing I also want to point out with damage over time is that damage over time is not actually affected by any color resistance. This is going to be very important, and it also kind of shows why Sukuna is actually a very good DPS even off color. In case you guys haven't seen it already, but I did release a video of Sukuna beating all 5 of the limited time illusory tower for this month. And obviously not all of the floors are weak against blue. A lot of them are actually resistant against blue. However, Sukuna is able to smash through all of them nonetheless because the damage over time is not actually affected by color. And it's actually quite easy for us to prove this as well. So from what we have seen just now is that we are able to do, so for example, this floor I have right now is resistance against blue, and the normal attack can do just under 6k damage, like 5.5 to 5.7k range, and the damage over time from what we are seeing is about 2k to 2.2k range. Okay, now let's actually go rather than floor 29, which is resistance against blue. Now let's try an actual blue floor, which is floor level 33. And we're going to do the same thing again. And now we're going to see whether they're actually going to change our damage over time. So if we do the same thing, now the thing with this game is that there's actually a defense stat, so there's only HP and attack. So that's kind of why even when you're up against different boss, as long as it doesn't have any built-in resistance or damage reduction, you should see similar amount of damage, and it's actually comparable. So what we're going to do here is again use skill 1 from Sukuna without any kind of buff or support. So what we're going to see is the damage. Here, initial damage over 10k, that's about 12k, okay? Damage instantly. However, damage over time, 2.1k, okay? And what that just shows is that even though the enemy is now actually weak against blue, and we can tell the difference because the instant damage from our skill is a lot higher. However, the damage over time is the same, which just shows regardless whether the enemy is weak against your color, weak against blue, or resistance against blue, you're going to get the same damage over turn. And the next thing I'm also going to show you, which is kind of going off on the same direction, is that what if we actually apply a support, which is actually only activated when you actually use that color. So now if we want to do it instead, it's rather than Gakuganji, which we already shown, right? The debuff from Gakuganji do work, okay? But what if we now actually change it to Blue Toge? And the same with Blue Toge is that if you actually take a look at his skill 3, you will see the skill 3 actually apply damage taken increase, however, it's only for the blue element. And what we have here right now is a blue floor, right? And Sukuna is actually blue himself. So normally we should expect the debuff from Toge should be applied here. However, let's take a look. Remember what we just done before from our testing. The normal attack done about, I think, over 12k damage instantly. However, the damage over time was only 2.1k. Or 2.2k range, okay? Now if we actually use skill 3, which remember only apply the damage taken when we actually do blue type of attribute attack. So if we apply this and then use skill 1 from Sukuna, okay? Now you can see the damage, instant damage did increase. That was 1.5k, almost 16k in fact. However, damage over time is still only 2.1k. And once again, this just proves your damage over time is not actually going to be impacted by any color-specific debuff or buff. So regardless whether it's the enemy have built-in resistance against blue color, or whether you are trying to do a support skill, which is only for blue type of colors, they're not going to work for the damage over time. Okay, now that we actually know how the laceration damage calculation works, let's go back to the character himself and talk about how to actually maximize his damage as a result. So out of the 4 skills that Sukuna have, the main one that you will be hitting is going to be Automata and also your skill 3. And the reason is, if you just take a look at the damage multiplier, it's absolutely crazy. My Automata is only at level 7, and I already have a base instant damage of 1.5k multiplier. And then on top of that, I have 4 times 50% times 4, so that is going to be another extra 400. Is that right? No, 16 times 50, 800. Another extra 800 damage over time on top of the 1.5k I'm able to dish out straight away. So if you just add up the numbers here, this is already a lot higher than any other multiplier of any attack in this game. So this is very, very hard hitting. And then likewise, when you actually use your domain expansion, what's going to happen is that it's going to do 2 things. One is it's going to give you 200 extra curse energy, which is great for your skill 3, which I'll talk about in a bit. And also it plays yourself a skill limit status, which basically means for the turn right after domain expansion, you are forced to only use skill 2. But that's actually okay, because when you actually use skill 2, under the skill limit status, what you're actually going to do is you will be applying a damage taken increase to the enemy. So even though you are forced to use this attack, it actually debuffs the enemy so that your skill 3 afterwards hits a lot harder. Because remember, this also gives 200 curse energy, and then you can use those 200 curse energy for your skill 3. Because this skill 3 basically has 3 different tiers, and at the highest tier, it only costs 90 curse energy. So with that 200 extra you got from domain expansion, you are guaranteed to be able to use this at least twice in a row. And when you actually use this, just take a look at this multiplier. Base damage is already 1.1k. This is only at level 8 as well. So that is by itself is already higher than a lot of the multiplier from other DPS. And on top of that, you have another 3 times 4 times 50. So that's another 600 extra. So that together is 1.7k multiplier of curse technique damage. Absolutely insane. So, and then if you take a look at the 4 turns, counting from when you actually use domain expansion, you literally start off with domain expansion. That's going to be like a 2.3k multiplier. You use 1 skill 2 to debuff the enemy. Then you hit with another 2 skill 3, which are each able to do at least 1.7k damage multiplier. Absolutely crazy when you add up all of them. It's literally like doing 4 ults in a row if you actually think about that. So this is absolutely crazy, and that's what makes Sukuna literally the best DPS if you talk about the numbers, okay? And even if we don't talk about numbers, but actually how he functions in the actual team itself, obviously for Blue, hands down, he's the best character, right? Because all of your attacks will be beneficial. All of your instant attack will be boosted by the fact you actually have color advantage. But even in off-color stages, he's still going to do well. Because even if I ignore the instant damage, just taking a look at this ultimate. This ultimate is able to do the damage over time portion 4 times 4 times 50. Okay, that's 800% scaling from his damage over time. That is not bad. That's actually on par with a lot of the other DPS. And likewise for his skill 3. He is able to do, at the highest level, 3 times 4 times 50. 600% scaling with his skill 3. So if you're actually able to do, once again, within that 4-turn window, you're able to do 800% multiply here, and then another 2 600 multiply back to back right afterwards. That's very hard hitting. So that's kind of why Sukuna works so well even when he's off color. And like I said, if you haven't seen my video already, I did create a video of Sukuna beating all of this month's limited time Illusory Tower, even for the off color stages. And that's basically the reason why Sukuna hits so hard there. Okay. Now let's talk about his other 2 skills. Now the skill vast majority of the time you want to use is going to be his skill 2 because this actually increases crit rate. Now there's going to be one caveat here, which is what I've shown before, right? Which is that if I actually get a crit on my attack, it's only going to boost how much instant attack I'm going to do. It's not actually going to boost my damage over time. Whereas if I actually take a look at his skill 1, this actually increases ultimate gauge and also actually apply laceration. And what that basically means is that depending on whether you're trying to use Sukuna for a blue stage or whether you're actually trying to use him for off color, if I'm using him for blue stage, skill 2 is the one you want to do all the time because you will be increasing your crit rate. So you're already hard hitting skill 3, and Automata is going to hit even harder with the instant damage you're able to do straight away. However, if you're actually using Sukuna for an off-color team, the skill 2 is actually quite useless because basically the crit rate doesn't affect your damage over time, which is actually going to be the main way you're going to do damage off color. And also obviously the attack itself, like physical technique, this is going to be weakened because you are battling a color resistant enemy. So therefore this skill 2 doesn't actually do much. And in those cases, skill 1 is probably actually going to be the better choice because first of all, you have to do a lot more damage with the laceration. Second thing is you actually recover ultimate gauge, which can then allow you to get more laceration out quickly. So depending on whether you're using him for blue type of stage, or whether you are actually playing him off color, you may want to decide between your skill 1 or skill 2. Now there's another reason why you may want to play skill 2 even when it's off color, even though the skill itself doesn't actually do much. And the reason is this is actually a physical technique attack. And that basically means is that you can actually stack it with pride. And pride is definitely by far the best recollection you can put on Sukuna. Now, there's a lot of people actually take a look at Pride and think, okay, the best reason why Pride is such a good recollection is because I can double stack it because I'll have this skill too, right? And that kind of makes sense on from one perspective, but the real reason what makes Pride so good on Sukuna is actually the fact that he has a very strong buff, which is based on times, and it also can last for a total of 8 turns. Because if we actually think about the damage window for Sukuna, right? We already talked about his damage over time is calculated at the instance when you actually use the attack. And if you actually think about it, I would frequently talk about this 4-turn window with Sukuna's domain expansion, because what you'll be doing is you'll be using your domain expansion, ultimate attack, then for about skill 2, and then for about 2 hits of skill 3. And your very first attack, the domain expansion, and also your third and fourth attack, the skill 3, they all hit very, very hard. So if you actually want to get the best amount of damage out of Sukuna, you almost want a buff which is able to last for a very, very long time, and is able to last for those, a whole whooping 4 turns if possible. And then if you actually take a look at a lot of the recollection in this game, for example, if you take a look at non-standard, this only lasts for 1 time in 1 turn, right? If you talk about any other kind of recollection, let's say strongest duo, right? Also another strong recollection, it only lasts for 2 turns. There's no way for you to be able to retain that buff any longer than that. Because now if I actually do something like, let's say I'll use my domain expansion, right? Yes, I'm going to get my buff on the turn when I actually use my domain expansion, when I use my ultimate attack. However, the turn right afterwards, I'm forced to use skill 2. So I can't actually take advantage of any other buff because what I actually want for is to actually for my buff to be retained all the way for my third attack or the fourth attack after my domain expansion. However, I'm not actually able to do that with any of the other recollection. The only recollection which can potentially work instead is gonna be, if I can have it, the Tokyo School one. This one, sorry. Purifying duties, but this one actually lasts for 3 turns. However, then if you take a look at the multiplier, this is actually really low. It's only 35% multiplier, and even though this one also do have a passive, which is a 20% damage dealt, so this can work over a long time. However, it's just an inferior choice to what your Pride is actually able to do, and that basically once again shows that why Pride is the best recollection for Sukuna. Not just because you can double stack it, but actually because the buff lasts for such a long time, you can actually take advantage of it and use it not just for your domain expansion, but also 2 turns later for your hard hitting skill 3. And the way you really want to do it is you still want to double stack, right? And it kind of works perfectly in the sense that you can use this every 5 turns, and the buff itself lasts for 8 turns. So what you want to do is on turn 1, you're activating this, right? And then what you'll do is you'll be spamming your skill 2 literally 4 times in a row. And then that brings you up to your turn 6. You'll be able to activate Pride again, use your domain expansion to take care of it. This will be under influence of the double stack of Pride. However, you still have 1 double stack remaining. And what's then going to happen is on turn 7, you'll be using skill 2 again because you're forced to do that. It's not going to use up any of your Pride stack. And then on turn 8, when you actually use your skill 3, you'll be under a double stack of Pride again. So you'll be hitting a very, very hard double buff ultimate attack and also double buff skill 3. So that's basically how you really want to take advantage of your Pride applied Recollection. Okay, and then in terms of what kind of teammates Sukuna really want, now Sukuna basically, I can't really mention his damage window is actually really long. So as a result, what ideally you want to do is you want buff or support skill, which can also last for a very long time. And that's kind of why Domain Gojo is actually going to be the best character out there for Sukuna, because Domain Gojo is actually able to apply a buff with his domain expansion, which lasts for a whole 4 turns, which is exactly the length of the damage window from Sukuna as well. And therefore, you are able to hit with a 300% damage taken increase on your Sukuna for all 4 of those turns. So that's kind of why it's extremely hard hitting, and that's why they work so well together. And the other thing you can also do is obviously just with your other buffers, which can also do buff for a very long time. So for the likes of Yoga, etc. Now with those kind of characters, there is a bit of thing you need to pay attention to, which is that because your buff already lost for 4 turns, and also your damage windows for 4 turns. So if you actually want to make sure you have 4 stacks of Yaga or Nanami's buff on Gakuganji's debuff, etc., for those all 4 of your attacks, your buff actually need to be stacked for 7 turns consecutively, which is actually a really long time. So if you're actually going to do that, you either have to, pay extra attention in terms of your curse energy management, or you pretty much want Kaito on your team to make sure you actually have those buffs every single time. And Kaito is great because Kaito is always able to provide curse energy so that all of your allies is actually able to stack over those buffs. But also the other thing is, remember, any curse energy you're going to give extra is actually going to be converted to more damage for Sukuna as well, because his skill 3 gets a lot stronger with his curse energy. So unlike the likes of other DPS such as Gojo or Toji, who can actually take advantage of the buff that Kaito is able to give, Kaito actually works extremely well with Sukuna, because any curse energy Kaito is able to provide not only indirectly buff up your Sukuna because you'll be stacking the buff on with your other supporter, but also directly make your skill 3 stronger and therefore allow you to hit your highest tier of damage a lot more often. So that's kind of why Kaito is also a great teammate with Sukuna. The last team I'm going to talk about, this one is a lot more strategic, and this one kind of needs Sukuna to be too dupe for it to work, but I still want to show you guys anyway. But basically, first of all, in terms of duping, because Sukuna is a limited character, all right, you want to dupe him, okay? And for any kind of DPS, basically what you want to do is you want to dupe it to at least the first stage, because that will be giving him 25% extra raw stats. And remember, raw stats means a lot for Sukuna when you have all of those damage over time, which is scaling off that raw stats, okay? So you definitely want to do this. Now, whether you want to dupe to Sukuna or not is going to be down to the strategic movement I'm going to talk about right now. And on a first look, you may think only plus 10 curse energy. That doesn't actually mean much, because if you actually take a look at how much curse energy Sukuna is going to require, it's 90. So a mere 10 is nothing compared to what's actually required for Sukuna. And likewise, as soon as you use a domain expansion, you're going to give 200 extra. So on a first look, that extra 10 curse energy from Dupe 2 doesn't actually mean much. However, there's one very strategic reason why you may want to do this, is that if you actually want to nuke on the second turn. And this is basically kind of like an example lineup that you may want to do. And basically with this, what you can do is that you can actually get to the maximum amount of buff from your Blue Momo, which only take 2 turns to stack up. And then you can also activate the ultimate attack from your Kaito, once again to buff your attack. And then what you can do is you can actually nuke with a very hard-hitting skill 3. So basically for this to work, what you want to do is you want to apply Unity, so that when you actually use Kaito's skill 3, what you're going to do is you're going to charge up his ult almost instantly with a combination of the skill 2 from Toge. So basically all of this allows your Kaito to actually charge up his ult straight away by the second turn. And then for your Sukuna, what you want to do is you just want to do whatever skill 1 or skill 2, doesn't really matter too much. Probably skill 2 just so you can maximize damage on your second turn. So with all of this, what you're going to see, and also Mutual Trust will be providing extra turn curse energy to Sukuna as well, okay? So with all of this, what you can see is that by the second turn, what's going to happen is that I am able to reach the maximum amount of stack of buff from my Momo because this only stack for 2 turns. So I already get a great amount of buff from my Momo, 120%-ish. I can use my ultimate attack from Kaito straight away already. This is another 100 and almost 110% curse technique increase as well, right? Target doesn't do anything. And then my Sukuna almost have 90 curse energy for me to use my skill 3 straight away, which I can then use, for example, my Recollection, and that is going to hit very, very hard. Now, as you can see, I only have 87 curse energy because I fell short because my Sukuna is only 0 dupe, it's not actually at 2 dupe. However, if I have my Sukuna at 2 dupe, what that basically means is that immediately I will be able to get 90 curse energy by my second turn. And then I literally would have one of the hardest hitting move in this game because I will be having what was it, like 100 and is it like 111? No, 1100, 1.1k scaling attack on my skill 3, which is already benefited from both the 120% buff from Momo plus another 110 curse technique buff from Kaito, which, by the way, the two of them are different multipliers, so you multiply them together, and then you apply whatever Recollection you have on your Sukuna. That's going to hit very, very hard, and that's probably the highest amount of damage any character can do by turn 2. So that is potentially one strategic reason why you want to get your Sukuna to dupe 10 just so that you're actually able to use this. Now, how useful is this? It's going to be very situational. It's like I said, it's more of a strategic purposes because you may actually need to hit very, very hard. You want to break the enemy early, or maybe to get past the first phase of the enemy, or maybe hit one of the minions to wipe them out straight away. You know, there are going to be some reasons why you want to do that, but it's not for every single stage. So depending on whether you feel like how much of a necessity this is, you may want to go all the way to 2 dupe just to get that extra 10 curse energy. And to be honest, even if you don't want to 2-dupe Sukuna, even though I think he's probably worth it because he's a limited character and one of the best character in the game, even if you don't want to do it, there's still ways around that, which is simply by equipping Sukuna with a Recollection that can give another 10 curse energy. So the best ones, for example, would be this one, for example, from Ghetto's banner, this one can give 10 curse energy when you actually use it. However, if you use this, you kind of need to do this on the turn before. So it's not ideal because you actually want to reach 90 curse energy by the time of the second turn. So you kind of need to activate this first, and then you won't actually benefit from this curse technique increase, which is not ideal. But at least you will still benefit from this passive curse technique increase. So that could be one way of doing it. The other way, which I actually think is better, which is a Magnificent Stride forward. This one, once again, provides a 10 curse energy for yourself when you actually have it. And then this is great because this you can actually now, because it's a passive, so you'll be activated straight away as soon as the battle starts. So you don't actually need to worry about using this on the turn before you're about to nuke, and then on the turn where you're actually about to nuke, you can then actually activate the active effect of this Recollection itself, which is actually a 60% curse technique. So I do think a Magnificent Stride forward is actually also going to be a very good Recollection choices if you want to go for the second turn nuke strategy and you don't have Sukuna to be too duped.